So I wanted to start off with some deep thoughts from the anthropological record. I think that one of the things that I like most about anthropology is not necessarily that you get to find the teeth and the dentition patterns and look at stone tools. Those are all good things, but you also get to spend some time being speculative about what makes us human and the human condition. So this is a quote from Jonathan Marks, who actually shows up a couple times in this chapter and shows up in different places in the textbook as well. He's a biological anthropologist, and this is from a blog post that he wrote back in 2011. And Marx is a very smart person, and that's why he shows up in the textbook. He's done a lot of formal publishing and research, but he also thinks of himself as a funny person, as a person who's humorous and likes to think about things like that. So if you read this blog post about primate taxonomy, he has a bunch of jokes about panini and all kinds of primate classifications that we've gone over without laughing at them. But he says here, you know, that when we think about stone tools and the emergence of culture, and everybody gets all excited because it's culture and it's stone tools, but as we've been talking about, there were lots of different Homo species coming around and using stone tools, and a lot of those species are gone. In fact, as we'll find out, all of them are gone. And so what Marx says here is, well, was culture really that great of an adaptation? Did it really work? Or are all these species gone? And I don't want to make us sad or get too depressed tonight. We have enough to get sad and depressed about. But if you think about, okay, humans are these great niche constructors. We've talked about how we create worlds out of our tools. But what happens if the niche construction known as climate change makes our own world inhabitable for humans? And let's say humans make it another 500 years and then we kind of fade out. If you looked in evolutionary terms, you'd say, wow, those humans had a great run. They did well, those humans, but really, they, you know, a couple million years, it's kind of a blip in the overall evolutionary scheme. So like I said, I don't want us to get depressed about this, but whenever we think about something as being advantageous or adaptive, we have to look at it in its own changing context. So that's deep thought number one. Deep thought number two, does it matter how big your head is? Does it matter how big your brain is? For a lot of paleo life, the scientists, as I've talked about, were obsessed with the emergence of intelligence. Scientists like to think that they are smarter and that they, as smart humans, that smartness is the thing that we should be looking for in the evolutionary and the archaeological record. And so people were relatively obsessed with how big the cranial size of each creature is. And it led in a lot of probably bad directions, as we talked about, because it allowed people to be hoaxed, because it was along these lines of the great chain of being, missing links, and all those things. And so there have been, I would say there have been two revolutions in our understanding about cranial size, brain size, and the evolutionary progression, or I don't want to call it progression, the evolutionary line that leads up to humans. And the first one came as early as the 1970s, when we figured out that a lot of the creatures that we were talking about were bipedal, but still had ape-like crania. So if you look at the Australopiths, and they were probably making stone tools, they've become bipedal, but their cranial size really hasn't shifted from the apes. So in terms of what separates out the most recent common ancestor of apes and that which would lead to Homo, it's bipedalism, it isn't cranial size. The second revolution I think is going on now, and it's still happening. And you can tell that there's a little bit of a tension sometimes in your textbook about some of these recent finds. Because one of the things we're finding as we find different, as our knowledge of the fossil record and of the genetics becomes more sophisticated, we're finding out that some creatures are able to use tools and do some really interesting things that we first thought were only possible of creatures that had big brains or big crania. One of the discoveries, which Lavin and Schultz talk about, there's still a lot of debate about these kind of small Homo fossils that were found in Indonesia. Definitely doesn't seem to be on the main line of human evolution. And there's been debate about what exactly they represent. The current standing is that Homo floresiensis is probably a separate subspecies. It's not simply a dwarfed species. And so it's a separate subspecies. But these are creatures that seem to be able to use fire, kill big lizards, and use tools, but don't have necessarily the big heads that we associated that with before. And then even more recently, the finding of Homo naledi in southern Africa, a really interesting find because you have these very complete skeletons, and they were preserved in a cave, and the people who found them insist that they were probably buried there. And if that's true, then we have a species that is burying its dead, funerary caching, also again using tools and having different anatomical aspects which we've always associated with late Homo, or early Homo, I should say. And it's been difficult to get a precise date on the Homo naledi find. But what seems true, or what seems to be the case, is that the whole obsession with and kind of grouping every fossil according to cranial size and thinking that would determine whether some creature could use tools or had rituals is perhaps misguided. So this is something that I think is currently revolutionizing our understanding of fossils in a way that was like what happened 50 years ago with the bipedalism research. The third thing in this chapter that was interesting to me to put out there is kind of like our obsession with cranial size. People have also been obsessed with the idea of hunting. And I'm not sure exactly why this is, but people have, our scientists have often wanted to declare that man the hunter was an important mover of evolution. And we've talked about this. There is evidence that there was hunting in some ways at various points. But a lot of people believe that the emphasis on hunting has been very overdone. And in some ways, one of the things, and we'll be talking about this more when we talk about different kinds of food patterns and plant and animal domestication, but the importance of women and gathering in most what used to be called hunting societies, but are now known as hunter-gatherer groups. The importance of gathering cannot be overestimated. And so there's been this kind of long-running debate about the importance of hunting and how it contributes to the calories and protein of any certain group. And then there was this book that came out about 10 years ago called Man the Hunted: Primates, Predators, and Human Evolution. And what these authors argued was that in order to understand what was going on in human evolution, that humans evolved among the great predators of Africa. And they probably spent more time being hunted than doing hunting. And so they were probably banding together in cooperation in order to keep from being hunted or survive among these in this environment. And so again, this is one of those things that is beginning, but only beginning to change our thinking about something that has been assumed to be a central piece of human evolution, which is hunting. So those three kind of the deep thoughts to start off when we think about these more perhaps mundane issues of fossil finds and dentition patterns and what teeth tell us about our behavior. This is a way to try and elevate or speculate on that conversation. Again, we'll be talking more about hunting, gathering when we talk in the next unit about food production. All right. You shouldn't have to write this down because it should already be in your notes. It's from the last part. It's where we ended the last class on Thursday with the expansion of Homo erectus. So here we have some relatively large creatures, some of which they're definitely bipedal. They have definitely larger brains. It's about 1.8 million years ago. They seem to be able to perhaps do that endurance running and hunting thing. They use fire, lots of tool use, look kind of, a sort of what we might call a more robust version of Homo sapiens. And they're the first bipedal creatures to expand from Africa into definitely into Asia and probably into parts of Europe and the Middle East as well. This is the first time we see that kind of expansion going on. So like I said, that was where we ended on Thursday. And the question has been, well, what is the relationship between some of these other lines that perhaps derive from Homo erectus and this expansion and the modern humans or Homo sapiens or what we call anatomically modern humans. And so one of the fun finds, or one of the fun things that a lot of you focused on in here is talking about the Neanderthals. Now, Neanderthals, first of all, as one of you noted, they get their name because some specimens were first discovered in the Neander Valley in Germany. And so that first part of the name, Neander, is the valley. And then Tal, T-A-L in modern German, or T-H-A-L in the old style German, is the word for valley. So Neander Valley. So you'll see both spellings. Most people today are starting to prefer, at least in the textbooks, the more modern spelling of German valley. But you see the T-H-A-L as well. The Neanderthals are a successful species of Homo. They lived in, especially, obviously, they were found in Germany, so they were found in Europe, but also in parts of the Middle East as well. From about 130,000 years ago, maybe earlier, to up to at least some of the latest specimens are found at about 30 to 35,000 years ago. Now, the Neanderthals are shorter and stockier than Homo sapiens. They're similar in a lot of ways, but I do want to emphasize they have, whoops, there, I misspelled that, massive skulls, continuous brow ridges, and protruding chinless faces. So you may have seen some stereotypical versions of Neanderthals, and because of those brow ridges and protruding chinless faces, they get stereotyped as being stupid. And when we call somebody, you may have noticed that so there was an insult lately was it last week that somebody removed some restrictions and they were said to have Neanderthal thinking. So this was an insult to some politicians about, the idea was they're being stupid, they're being a Neanderthal. Now, interestingly, when we insult the Neanderthals as being stupid, if you just did their cranial capacity, they actually have a larger cranial capacity than modern Homo sapiens. So this is an interesting thing to think about in some ways. It doesn't mean we thought exactly alike or that they're smarter than us. You have to remember that these are raw numbers. They're not as a percentage of body size. And also, as we've talked about, simply looking at cranial capacity is not a one-to-one correlation of intelligence or smartness. But we have to, we have to at least acknowledge here that the Neanderthals are pretty smart out there, or they seem to be successfully surviving in this environment. When you go a little bit later in the reading is where they talk more about the kind of the social life. So some of you want to know more about their similarities and differences with human beings or Homo sapiens. There's evidence again, but some people argue each way that the Neanderthals were burying their dead. Recently, the evidence seems to be shifting in favor of some pretty sophisticated Neanderthal behavior. So people have found jewelry that's associated with Neanderthals, and some of the early cave paintings are said to perhaps be part of Neanderthal art. It also seems clear from the ways in which we found fossilized bones that they actually kept their sick alive, that they were kind of compassionate to the sick and the old, and they were able to care for them in ways that perhaps when we say Neanderthal, we're being too mean. Some people also speculate that they probably did a lot of hunting. As one of you noted, there's from the brain, the hemispheres of the brain that speculated that a lot of them were right-handed. This is something that we share with a number of non-human primate relatives. So you might remember when we were watching The Life of Mammals, and that orangutan was using a saw, and that orangutan was left-handed. So being a certain kind of handedness is often associated with the larger primate species. The Neanderthals, there's also skeletal and muscular evidence that some of them were quite muscled on one side or another. So that for those of you who've played against a right-handed or left-handed basketball player, it's something that you can know that they're going in a certain direction because they're going to favor that hand. But in the case of the Neanderthals, it seems to be that they were really scraping hides or doing something which would have really bulked up one side of the body in that way. So they were not just like Homo sapiens, but they were similar to Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens appear in, I used to say that Homo sapiens appear about 200,000 years ago. But in the last few years, we found some older fossils, actually, interestingly, in Africa, but in Morocco, which is a place where we hadn't expected necessarily to find Homo sapiens. But as I put it in the fossil, when we're talking about the mysteries of human evolution, there's a lot of different places that fossils can be found or might have been found, but are not necessarily productive. So this was a really interesting find in the last few years that pushes back our understanding of how what are called Homo sapiens or anatomically modern humans emerging at around 300,000 years ago. And so, as we've talked about, we have Homo sapiens like Homo erectus first emerging, the first evidence for Homo sapiens in Africa. And then they, like Homo erectus, spread into Eurasia, into the Middle East, and then Europe and Asia. And then, as Levin and Schultz put it in the final parts of the chapter, Homo sapiens are the only hominins, the only bipedal species who made it into Australia. So maybe 30 to 50,000 years ago into Australia, which is a pretty big feat. You had to actually cross open water to do that, and populate the Americas, so North and South America, probably around 15,000 years ago. And Lavin and Schultz go into some various ideas about when exactly that happened. But this is the first time that we see bipedal creatures spread into all parts of what we would call the habitable world. Eventually, the Homo sapiens interact with some of the other bipedal species that were there, but eventually all the other bipedal species disappear, leaving only Homo sapiens. And so when the Neanderthals were first found, when they first found the skeletons in the Neander Valley, some people wanted to argue that they were our direct ancestors, but it soon became clear that they were not directly ancestral to Homo sapiens. But for a long time, for many years, the question has been, what happened? Why did the Neanderthals disappear? Why did the Homo sapiens basically stay? And what was the interaction between these groups, or was there any? Did they have offspring? Did they interbreed? Did they get along? Did they fight? What was the deal? There have been a couple different models proposed for this. One of the earliest models proposed by an anthropologist named Weidenreich was an idea that he called multi-regional evolution. And it's a very old idea. It comes to us, there's a book he published in 1946, and we actually had it in the library, and I copied out this diagram. And in this diagram, you'll see a lot of terms here that are not up to date. We do not call modern people by these terms. But his model of how evolution happened was quite sophisticated. And what he was proposing, and what other people, what Lavin and Schultz would later be called the same thing, called the regional continuity model, is that across this whole lattice shape, that what you had was constant gene flow among the Homo erectus populations that were in Africa and had left Africa. And their argument was that Homo sapiens basically evolved across this whole range of regions, so that there was some continuity with some of the original Homo erectus populations, but that Homo sapiens evolved across all of these populations, and that everything that would be advantageous to, or a property of Homo sapiens, would spread by gene flow across this area. And so it's actually a very interesting idea, and it was a complex idea of how Homo sapiens emerged across this range, but we're still linked to some of the earlier Homo erectus dispersals. In 1987 and 1988, a new model came out, and it was done based on mitochondrial DNA. And it made a big splash at first. This was the cover of Newsweek, because it posited that if you did the mitochondrial DNA, that all humans had one common mother in Africa that was dated to at the time, around 75,000 years ago. And so this was called, it had various names. Sometimes they called it mitochondrial Eve because it came to us from the mitochondrial analysis. It was also called Out of Africa 2 because it was saying that Homo sapiens this was the second migration out of Africa that really gives us the modern Homo sapiens. Also known as African Eve, but eventually Lavin and Schultz call it the replacement model. And it's called the replacement model because it posits that really there wasn't any continuity between the older Homo erectus populations that were out of Africa 1 and the second migration of Homo sapiens, that they replaced all the existing populations. Interestingly, from 1987, when the model was proposed, up through 2010, it seemed to be winning in the range of ideas and hypotheses. It was becoming more and more prominent. And in some ways, my life was becoming easier because the regional continuity model was in some ways going away. That is, we were getting more and more genetic studies which said that there was no interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and there didn't seem to be any contribution from some of these older groups into the Homo sapien lineages. And the people who were still into the regional continuity model were on the back foot. They were losing the battle of ideas. There were still a few people sort of saying that it was the right way to think, but it was being criticized. As I said, it was a complicated model, and so a lot of people were not understanding it correctly. And in some ways, it was simply disappearing from the textbooks. Now, I want to say here that in both of these models, and because there've been some back and forth between the models about, about whether or not they would sort of have different roles for what we might call human races. Both of these models from the beginning always said that Homo sapiens emerged and are one interbreeding species. Neither of them said that Homo sapiens had been isolated or that Homo sapiens had evolved in different places. In both models, both the replacement model and the regional continuity model, they both agreed that Homo sapiens are one interbreeding species across the world. So this is the situation in 2010. And then in 2010, which is when we got our surprise, some very sophisticated genetic analysis was able to, by using different stuff and techniques, whenever you want to know how did they do it, I mean, this was some very sophisticated analysis which was unavailable at the time, and doing different kinds of matching onto DNA, we're able to determine that there must have been some contribution of the Neanderthals into the modern human genome. And so I call it the 1 to 4% admixture surprise, because it's a contribution that ranges from 1 to 4%. It's very subtle. It's very difficult to detect, and that's why people had not detected it before. It seems to be, we used to think it had to be in Europe because that's where we had found a lot of the Neanderthals, but it seems to have probably occurred in the Middle East as Homo sapiens were moving into those areas and then spreading out from there. There was, because we find this admixture both in European populations and a slightly different signature in Asian populations. And so this is where we see this kind of admixture, usually more of it. Some of you want to know who has more, usually more in European and Asian populations, but also anyone who has intermixed with those populations as well. So there's a lot of it in the Americas as well, and also in Africa, because there was a sort of back into Africa. The other surprise from around that time, around 2010, was the discovery of a few bones. There's not a lot of fossil or archaeological evidence for this species, but there is a decent amount of genetic evidence that there's a Denisovans, who are kind of like the cousins of Neanderthals, but are further to the east, more in Asia. And so what they were also able to describe is that there's some contribution of Denisovan admixture in some contemporary human populations. Most of those are in Australia or in Asia. So what we now think, or what seems to be emerging, is something like this. So if you think about Homo erectus spreading into the old world, and then in Africa, you would have Homo naledi and other, or what we call archaic Homo populations. In the Middle East and Europe, you'd have the Neanderthals, and closely related, they're cousins, but a separate subspecies too, the Denisovans. And that in some ways, these groups contributed, probably not Homo naledi, but certainly the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, to the contemporary human genome. So that as Homo erectus populations disappear, leaving these other populations, and they did interact and interbreed with Homo sapiens as they emerged. So what does it mean? What can we deduce from all of this? First of all, a lot of people have taken this Neanderthal admixture and gone a little nuts with it. So I have read things like, oh, the Neanderthals gave me my allergies, or they made me addicted to cigarettes, or you have to be very careful with these kinds of things. Like I said, this is a very subtle genetic evidence that people have been talking about. So Lavin and Schultz urge us to be cautious when we're talking about these finds, because we're still not exactly sure what the contribution is, where exactly it's distributed, and if it has much functional effect on the human genome. What's interesting here is that John Relaford, who actually is he just recently retired from SUNY Oni Anta, so he lives just across the street. Back in 2001, proposed a different model than regional continuity and the replacement, and he said it's mostly out of Africa. And turns out he seems to be the most correct person of all, in that what he was saying is that most of human anatomy and most of the human genome is what happens in Africa, but there was also some stuff coming in from other places, and there was a sort of back into Africa events and processes that happened as well. And so I'm not sure that they do say that it's a model, but it's more like a description of what we know about human origins and how we became human. The big conclusion for me, and Lavin and Schultz mentioned, that we now know that human populations, these archaic Homo erectus and other populations, were moving around and migrating a lot more than we believed for a long time. And so we talked in the last class, this is not a surprise to us, because we talked about mobility and migration as fundamental to the human process. So what I would like to emphasize here is that human beings have been mating and mixing and moving around ever since we became human beings. It's something that we've been doing with all kinds of different populations since the beginning. So this is not just something that happened 20 years ago when people started moving into different places. We've always been migrating, moving, going into different places, and seeking to be together with the other creatures that are there. And so we see at the end of this chapter, the spread here, and this is a diagram, a map of all the places that Homo sapiens are found. And so we talked about Homo sapiens as the first and only hominins to be able to go into Australia. And so we see Homo sapiens in Australia, and to be able to go into the Americas. So they've spread out from Africa and are able to go into all these different places. And what is it that makes Homo sapiens able to do this? There's a few, at the end of the chapter, there's some speculations on this. From Stephen Jay Gould, what he says is that human evolution is an unrepeatable particular. And by that he means that it wasn't the destiny, just because people went just because there were creatures that were bipedal and started using tools, that doesn't mean that there would be inevitably a species that would then take over or inhabit the entire planet. So it's something that if you rewound the tape and set it off again, you wouldn't necessarily get the same outcome. Potts here calls it the survival of the generalist, which is to say that instead of survival of the fittest, it wasn't that humans could be fit in the Arctic and the Australian climates that are so completely different. It's that we had to be flexible. We had to be able to learn. We had to be what is called plasticity, able to adapt and open to different climates, different conditions, in order to have this remarkable spread. So it isn't, of course, that humans are biologically adapting to any of these places. It's that you have learned behavior and culture, which makes it possible to adapt to all kinds of different environments, even before there was much technology and air conditioning and things like that. So backing up a little bit to the big points of human evolution, when we look out over what we get from Darwin through today. So first point, from the idea of natural selection that was proposed by Darwin and Wallace, is that variation, or what we might call diversity, is essential to evolution. You can't have evolution without diversity or variation. And so this is extremely important to us as we think about the process of what gives us our variability and what makes us human. The second big point is that there is no such thing as absolute fitness. And so you're always making trade-offs, sight for smell. Sometimes big heads means more resources used. And the environment is always changing. And so some traits that are adaptive in one environment might become maladaptive in another environment. There isn't a necessary fitness or survival of the fittest which can be measured on one scale when the environment is always changing. We also now know that organisms are always themselves inadvertently or sometimes by choice trying to modify and change their own environments. And so it's not just that the genetic code is set and that you have to adapt to a different environment. Organisms are also trying to change those environments. This is what we talked about in terms of niche construction, of being able to alter the environment so that it would change the conditions of selection in the next generation, which is part of what some biologists have been arguing for, the extended evolutionary synthesis, which adds on to the ideas of natural selection and heritability. The other thing I would say about evolution is stuff happens that you didn't know was going to happen. And a lot of people want to know why did this happen or why did that happen? Sometimes you don't know why. So if we rewound the evolutionary tape back to those big dinosaurs, back when mammals were like little tiny mammals and you'd have dinosaurs everywhere, nobody knew that there was going to be an asteroid that was going to change the climate of the Earth. If you had to go back in time, you'd think that the mammals were not going to do anything. There wouldn't be an age of mammals. It was going to be the age of the dinosaurs. Or if you went back and looked at how robust and adapted the Neanderthals were, you would probably place your bets on them. It'd be like these puny Homo Sapiens, they'll never make it through the winter. They'll never survive. And so we can't necessarily predict. It's difficult to predict who's going to emerge in the evolutionary landscape because things are always changing. One of the interesting things of this human story is because of all this diversity and variation, and that our own ancestors, up until about 30,000 years ago, were probably interacting with a much wider range biologically of other bipedals than we do today. And so if you look at what Homo sapiens are today, human beings, we have one single interbreeding species of human beings across the world. We can all interbreed with each other. And this is in some ways a smaller set of an earlier variation, which was larger, that had different kinds of features. Neanderthals, we now know we can interbreed with them, or Homo sapiens could, but at that time, they seemed pretty different. So humans emerged as the only interbreeding species, and we do it because of flexibility and being able to learn and adapt in different environments. Now, the final point of this is that if we take all of this together, then those people who want to say that one human group or a human race, or we might say a subspecies, is superior or inferior, we should be very suspicious of that, because the force or the thrust of evolution is to proliferate diversity. And if we look at the human evolutionary story, it doesn't make human race make sense.